first time the intercom said a student's name that didn't exist, everyone laughed until it said mine and told me to come alone to a room that had been locked for years. The day it started felt like any other Tuesday, which is probably why so many people remember it with this infuriating shrug, like it couldn't have been what it was, like the worst things only happen on Fridays or when it rains. The sky was spotless and too bright for October, and the lunch bell had that tinny ring that means freedom if the morning hasn't already chewed through nerves and patience. I was halfway down the math wing when the intercom popped alive with a static hiss, then cleared, then said in that neutral office voice, "Would student Chester Hale report to the main office?" with this pause at the last name, like the voice had to pick the right word out of a hat. Nobody named Chester went to our school, and I know that because we all joked about it before the period ended. The guidance counselor had just given a senior assembly about how names matter, and the whole thing felt like a coincidence with a punchline. Still, the voice made the hall sound thinner, like it stretched between doors, like something could push through it if it wanted to. Lunch smelled like reheated pizza and bleach, which is how every cafeteria smells if the custodian is doing their job. And my table was in the corner by the vending machines that sometimes $8 bills like they were alive. To pass the time, we bet on how long it would take for Chester Hale to become a meme. How long until someone doctored a hall pass with his name or changed a locker tag or scribbled it on a bathroom stall next to a phone number. The intercom popped again in the middle of the noise and said, "Chester Hale, main office, right away please," which sounded like a teacher doing the office voice, but the cafeteria monitors didn't look up. Someone said maybe Chester was a substitutes kid, or a new transfer, or one of those names from a different roster that got carried over from last year because the computer system is a joke. This is how excuses live. They climb on the backs of the loudest people and ride them until everything feels fine. 8th period was history in room 204, and the blinds made stripes across the whiteboard, and a fly kept hitting the glass over and over with this dry little click that put grit in the back of my teeth. Halfway through the lecture, the intercom clicked live again, and the voice said, "Would student..." Then static folded over the rest, so the teacher had to stop talking and look up. The voice came back, "Would student please report to room 017 immediately?" And then it said a bell tone, like the sound they use at the end of morning announcements, like someone pressed the wrong button. Room 017 was the old media room in the basement, the one they sealed up 2 years ago when there was a leak and part of the ceiling went soft and fell in. We all knew it was locked because seniors tell freshmen legends about it during Spirit Week, about a teacher who stayed late and heard voices on the speakers when all the lights were off, about a janitor who swore music played through the intercom while the power was cut during a lockdown drill. The hallway outside 204 got quiet like a mouth shutting. At 3:05, the final bell rang and everything exploded the way it always does. Sneakers, lockers, the perfume cloud that hangs at the top of the stairwell and then breaks apart on the wave of bodies rolling down. I stopped at the top of the basement stairs because for a second, I thought I heard my name in the air. Not from a voice, but from the way the stairwell carries certain frequencies, the way steps become messages if someone wants them to be. I told myself that if I walked past the nurse's office and saw the basement door open, I'd go home. If it was closed, I'd go look, like that made sense. The door was ajar by maybe an inch. There's a kind of cold that belongs to school basements. The kind that lives in cinder block and old posters and coils of black cables that look like sleeping snakes under matte paint. The light down there has weight, and ceiling panels melt into blotches where a leak changed their DNA, and every step echoes like it's guilty. The door to 017 was at the very end, with a wire glass window wired shut from the inside, and a paper sign that used to say media, but now only said DIA because the whole left side peeled away. I told myself I'd look through the wire glass and go home. From inside the room, the intercom crackled like gravel poured into a metal bucket. The sound wasn't coming from the ceiling speaker above me in the hall. It was coming through the door, from the dead room, with a soft feedback whine like the heartbeat of a machine that isn't supposed to be alive. And then the voice said my name, my full name, first and last, with a middle name my mother only uses when she's scared for me to cross the street. It said, "Please report to room 017, alone, no backpack," and the last two words sounded like they were borrowed from a memory of being told to leave phones at the door during tests. I stepped back because in that exact moment the light over the stairwell flickered and an echo came from the far end of the hall that sounded like the squeak of a gym shoe turning fast. There shouldn't have been anyone else down there. Something brushed the back of my jacket. It could have been air, or the ghost of a draft, or the way the stairwell breathes when someone opens a door upstairs. I pivoted so fast my backpack shoulder strap snapped and slid down my arm. And because fear can be a kind of hypnosis, I found my eye level with the wire glass window of 017. Inside it was darker than the hallway by a full shade. The kind of dark that makes eyes reflect light like animal eyes do on mountain roads. And there was one reflection, one point of shine that wasn't mine. Low, as if someone sat on the floor or crouched with their head tilted. The intercom voice whispered, not loud now, not official, but the kind of hush people use at deathbeds. Open, like it was tired of being polite. Fear and curiosity share the same ladder in the brain. Climb one too far, and it turns into the other. I put my palm on the handle, and it was cold enough to burn. The door didn't move, locked like it should be, but the handle gave a millimeter-like soft muscle. I thought I saw movement under the door, the shadow of something flattening itself in the gap. But when I crouched and looked, all I saw was darkness dense enough to swallow a pencil if one rolled toward it. Then from behind me down the hall came a second voice, human, older, with air behind it. The security guard's voice calling down the stairwell. Who's down there? I stepped away from the door so fast I felt skin catch on the wire glass. In the same second, the intercom inside 017 hissed a noise like breath pulled through teeth and said nothing else. Security didn't believe me, or did, but didn't want to make paperwork out of belief. They checked the door, rattled it, flashed a light through the glass, and found only chairs stacked like barricades and a coiled HDMI cable on a metal cart. The office secretary said the intercom had been glitchy since morning announcements and the tech would come tomorrow. Upstairs, the building was loud again. Football pads clapping, the choir practicing a scale that sounds like someone trying to talk through walls. I went home telling myself that nothing had happened but me getting spooked by a lockdown story made into a dare by an empty room. That night, after dinner, the phone rang with the school's robocall number, the one that warns about weather cancellations and PTA fundraisers. My mom put it on speaker while she cleaned the counter, and we both waited for the principal's cheerful tone attached to bad news. Instead, the intercom voice, flat, manufactured but somehow the same, said, "This is an important message for the household of," and it said my name. Careful again with the middle one, then paused like it was chewing. It said there had been a disciplinary issue involving me leaving a class without permission to enter a restricted area, and that further action would be determined, and then it clicked off mid-sentence. My mom went still in that way that makes her look like a picture that remembers it's alive. She asked what I did, and I said nothing she would believe without a hallway and a locked door to point at. The next morning, I went to the main office to clear it up because that's what students in stories never do, and I wanted to do the opposite of the stupid thing. The secretary looked at me like I had asked for a snow day in June and said there was no robocall sent the previous night and no record of a call placed to our number from the system. The vice principal asked which teacher had given me permission to go downstairs. And when I started to explain, he cut me off and said the basement hallway cameras were down. Again, and would be fixed today if we can get parts. He smiled in a way that made me feel like a mirror catching the wrong face. By lunch, the joke had metastasized. Someone had changed the name on my locker tag with a strip of label maker tape that said Chester in neat block letters. The intercom popped on just before fifth period and said, "Would student Chester Hale report to the main office?" And a few kids yelled, "Woo!" like at a pep rally. Then an hour later, right after the bell, it corrected itself. Correction, would student, and it said my name again, slow like it was learning the shape of the mouth in real time. Report to room 017. The teacher laughed, this thin laugh people use to be safe with each other, and said, "Okay, that's enough." Very funny. Even though she wasn't the one speaking, we all pretended the ceiling didn't have eyes. I went back downstairs after school because horror sometimes feels like gravity and sometimes like obligation. The door to 017 was shut, and the wire glass made that fishnet pattern across everything. And behind it I could see the card again, The chairs again. The place where the ceiling had buckled and left a bruise. I pressed my ear to the metal and listened because that's what people do in stories, and I wanted to learn the wrong lesson for once. There was nothing at first, then the softest scrape, like paper being pulled across a rough desk, then breath, then my name, not through speakers this time, but through the tiny gap under the door, shaped by someone's mouth very close to the floor. I stepped back and ran, and the hall made sure every step was registered for later. 2 days later, the principal got on the morning announcements to say there would be a full school lockdown drill during third period, and to please follow your teacher's instructions and remain calm. The lights went off with that soft surrendering click. Desks scraped. The class cornered itself into silence. The door locked. The hallway turned into a negative of itself. We listened for the principal's walkie, but what we heard instead was the intercom breathing in. And then, "Students, this is a drill," it said, with the calm of a voice that has never had a reason to be anything else. One by one, it started listing names to report to the nearest office for quick procedural checks. But the names didn't belong to our school. They were old-fashioned, from yearbooks we'd seen in the library. The ones with black and white portraits and short haircuts and eyes that stare right through you because they didn't know about photographs yet. The last name it said was mine. The teacher shook her head, no so hard her hair hit her cheek. She texted the office, and the read receipts stacked up without replies, and the hall stayed empty through the narrow lock window. The intercom sighed again and said my name one more time, 3 pieces, first, middle, last, like a spell, and then, clear as anything, room 0017, with a softness that felt like a hand on the back of the neck. The teacher squeezed my wrist under the desk hard enough to leave fingerprints without ink. We stayed like that for a long time. When the lockdown lifted, there was no principal on the speaker, just a bell tone, and the hallway filled with door bolts sliding, shoes, voices that dared to laugh because a joke is the easiest thing to be after fear has done its work. The vice principal stood at our door and said there had been a communications test that overlapped systems, and no cause for alarm, and no names were read, and no one was called. And our teacher nodded, like she wanted it to be true more than she wanted anything else. Later that day in the library, I asked the librarian to help me find old yearbooks, just to see if I was making connections out of dust. We pulled the 1983 book, then 1979, then 1974, and there it was. A photo of a boy with a way of looking slightly left of the camera, with his name under it, Chester Hale, deadpan font, no middle name. I stared at it until the eyes looked like 2 tiny cuts pressed into paper. The librarian said something about a flood in the old media room that year, a ceiling collapse, a wiring issue, a small fire no one ever talks about because it wasn't big enough to be history, just big enough to be a story. She closed the book as if that could end the sentence. That night, when the house was finally quiet, my phone buzzed with a no-caller ID number that displayed as school, because the device thinks patterns are facts. I let it go to voicemail because fear sometimes wears the mask of being rational. The message began with the alert tone the intercom uses before morning announcements, and then my name, patient, careful, tender, and a whisper, bring no backpack, then a click. Then the thin hiss of an empty line that still thinks it can speak. I didn't go back to the basement, but the next day, somebody had peeled the label off my locker and replaced it with a fresh strip that said nothing at all. When the bell rang, it sounded exactly like a voice clearing its throat. The substitute walked in, closed the door without looking back, and then called roll, using full names, middle names included, names none of us had written on the sheet yet, names no one in that room had ever said out loud at school. Third period English was the kind of class where the clock sounded louder than anyone's voice, where the second hand bounced like it wanted to jump but stayed, and where the blinds never sat level. So the sunlight fell in uneven bars across scuffed desks and the dictionary shelf that nobody touched. Mrs. Peterson was out sick, for the first time anyone could remember, and that felt wrong already because she wore perfect attendance like some teachers wear pearls. When the sub entered, tall, slate gray suit, no lanyard, no clipboard, he didn't look at the posters or the desks or the crooked flag. He looked at the ceiling speaker first, just a glance, the way someone checks a mirror to see who's really in the room with them. He pushed the door shut until the latch clicked like a knuckle cracking, and the room softened, as if the hallway had been the source of the day's color, and closing it had turned us all slightly grayscale. No one asked his name because he didn't offer it. And instead of taking attendance by reading off the printed sheet that lay face down on Mrs. Peterson's desk, he picked up a stub of chalk and wrote words on the board we couldn't read at first because they were too small, threading across the top line like stitches. He turned and said, "Let's begin," and then he called on Ava, and said not just Ava, but Ava Elise Martin. And the way he hit the middle name made her blink, because that wasn't on the attendance, and none of us knew it. He did it again with Brian, then Natalie, then Jamal, each first, middle, last. The middle name snug like a secret whispered in a car ride home when a parent is trying not to be angry. When he got to me, he said my name with a careful tenderness, and hearing it arranged like that in a stranger's mouth felt like being seen through a window from the street at night. Kids tried to make a joke of it, because that's how fear gets turned into something that can be passed around until it thins out. Brian muttered that the sub was probably ex-military, or HR had given him access to our files, or the school's new software prints the middle names now, and a couple of us nodded because reasons are blankets we pull up to our chins when the temperature drops in the gut. The sub smiled in a way that rearranged nothing in his face and said, "Literature is pattern recognition," and then he drew 3 horizontal lines on the board with the side of the chalk, each line lighter than the last, as if he were grading the strength of a whisper. He told us to take out a sheet of paper and write about the last time we heard our name spoken by someone who shouldn't have known it. No one laughed that time. Halfway through the silent period, when pens scraped like insects testing walls, the intercom crackled and fell into that hush that means the office is about to step into class like a parent into a bedroom. The principal's voice started, "Good morning, staff and students," then stopped like someone had put a hand over the mouthpiece, and after a soft rustling, said instead, "Please remain in classrooms," without using the word drill, without the bell tone, without the careful calm they keep for us like a glass they don't want to break. The sub didn't look at the speaker this time. He looked at each of us, one at a time, in a slow pan like a camera trying to memorize faces for later, and then walked to the door and turned the lock with a small deliberate click. He said, "You'll hear a sound," and I think maybe part of me decided to stop writing the exact moment my hand started to shake. The sound came like an echo with no original, a distant scraping that couldn't belong to anyone walking. A chair leg maybe, dragged down a hall but stretched, like it had been recorded on tape that aged wrong. The room went still in that deep way rooms do when people agree to be animals together, breath shallow, eyes big, chests tight. The sub stood near the window and tilted the blinds with 2 fingers carefully, as if pulling on the lip of a wound to see how deep it went. Outside, the courtyard lay empty except for leaf rot and the fountain that never worked, and seniors' chalk art ghosting through the rain. Names and dates and hearts with arrows that look so gentle in sun and so accusatory under clouds. On the board he wrote 4 dates, all from years before we were born, with slashes instead of dashes, like they used to do in older calendar printouts. He tapped the chalk under 1/10/17, then looked back at us as if the number were a question we should answer with our faces. Natalie raised her hand because she always does, and said those were the dates of incidents, and then flushed because the word felt wrong in her mouth. Too official, too neat. The sub said, "This building keeps time differently," and his voice had an edge of grief in it that made the hairs on my arms rise like they were reaching for something they didn't want to touch. The intercom hissed again, softer, like a pot boiling over a little. A voice that wasn't the principal's and wasn't the secretary's said, "Staff, initiate room clear protocol," then reversed itself. Syllables flipping like a tape played backward and repeated, "Remain in place," clean and calm as if nothing had happened. The sub didn't move, but his fingers flexed at his sides, a tiny tremor that made a small cloud of chalk dust lift off his knuckles. He said, "You'll feel the building breathe," and when he said it, the AC kicked on, and the ceiling vents rattled in sequence down the hall like a line of something moving just out of view. Jamal, who never asks for trouble but finds it, stood half out of his seat and asked if this was a drill inside a drill. Because last year a substitute had messed up the timing and got written up, and the sub said, "No, the way someone says no to a child standing too close to a stove. He walked to the back closet, the one that always sticks, and tugged it open. And inside were TV carts stacked with dust, AV cords coiled like sleeping snakes, and a box of index cards with a film company logo so old it looked foreign. He set the index cards on Mrs. Peterson's desk and spread 5 of them like tarot. Each had a word typed in all caps. Left justified, faded at the edges from age and thumb grease. Drill, intruder, clear, hold, evacuate. He palmed one we couldn't read and slid it under his hand like a magician hiding a coin. Then he said my name again, all 3 parts like he was checking if it still fit me, and asked me to stand at the back of the room by the closet. My legs felt like they belonged to the desk, but I went, because the way he asked had gravity in it. He handed me a key on a gray rubber ring that looked like it had been cut off a balloon, and said, if we hear a second sound, you open that closet again, and you will see a panel inside that no longer exists and never did, and you will not touch it, which is not the kind of instruction that calms a person. I nodded anyway because saying anything felt like attaching a rope to something I didn't want to anchor. We didn't get a second sound at first. We got a smell. Old water and warm metal, the scent of a leak that's traveled through a building's bones before confessing itself on a tile. The sub inhaled through his nose like he'd been waiting for that exact note, and he said, they're following the route, under his breath, which isn't the sentence anyone in a classroom wants to hear. The hall beyond our door felt like it pressed closer, the way darkness does when the eyes adjust and realize how much isn't visible. The first real knock shook the door frame like a body had leaned into it shoulder first. Every head in the room snapped up as if controlled by a string, and the sub raised a single finger to his lips in a shh that asked for more than quiet. It asked for belief. The second knock came higher, like a fist had found the narrow window and wanted to see if the glass would sing. The third was soft, like someone tapping a spoon on a mug to call a family to the table in a house that never had one. Then a voice, too close to be the intercom and too clean to be the hall, spoke right outside the door in a tone we all recognized from morning announcements. This is a drill, it said, without a name attached to it, without the bell, in the exact cadence of safety turned inside out. Ava started to cry in that quiet way where tears fall without the face moving. The sub didn't go to the door or the window. He went to the board and erased the dates until the chalk smeared into a low gray cloud on the black, and then he wrote 2 names, and the first one was mine. He said, if your name is on the board, you do not answer when you are called. And his voice had dropped even lower, not loud enough to touch the corners of the room. Jamal whispered, how would we answer? No one's going anywhere. And the sub said, there are other ways to answer, which lit something cold behind my ribs. The doorknob turned once, twice, with a patience that felt like practice. The lock held, and the knob rested, and then a finger slid into view at the narrow window. Not a whole hand, just the tip of an index finger tapping, tap, 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 slow enough to count between beats. The sub stepped toward the closet, and for a second his suit looked older, like a photograph more than a garment, like each thread had a decade attached to it. He told me without looking at me, don't open it unless you hear the second sound. And then he stood still again, like a person finding their place on a map in their head. The intercom coughed to life and cut itself off 3 times in a row, like a stutter rehearsed. On the 4th, the principal's voice returned, steady but thinner. Teachers, please hold. And then newer words, as if borrowed. Do not acknowledge roll calls from unfamiliar voices, which sounded like a policy someone wrote after something already happened. The sub nodded once to no one, as if he had been waiting for the school to remember its own rules. Then he picked up the hidden index card from the desk and turned it over so we could see the word, hold. We never heard the second sound. What we heard was the absence, stretching, the way a rubber band can hold a shape too long and then snap back and leave a line in the skin. The tapping stopped and the hall exhaled, and somewhere down the corridor a locker slammed, once, not with anger, just with the weight of metal deciding to be itself again. The sub unlocked the door and opened it an inch, listened, then shut it and left it locked. And that decision settled the room like a blanket. When the all clear finally came, with the bell tone, with the official phrasing, With the relief teachers' practice in their voices, our sub didn't unlock the door right away. He wrote one last line on the board, "You are not your name," and underlined it twice, chalk snapping on the second, a clean break that made everyone flinch. Then he opened the door, and in the hall stood our principal with 2 security guards. All surprise and professional courtesy, and the principal said, "Thank you for keeping them calm, mister," and paused. Because there was no last name to attach, no badge to glance at, the sub smiled the smile that rearranged nothing and said, "You're welcome," and walked past the 3 of them without brushing a shoulder. And that was the last moment we saw him. Later, Mrs. Peterson swore she hadn't called out sick. The office had no sub scheduled, no paperwork, no signature in the log, and the camera in the hall that faces our door glitched at 10:03 and came back at 10:41, which is a hole big enough to swallow a person's shape. When we checked the board after lunch, the names were gone, erased to a smudge that looked like a fingerprint too wide to belong to a human hand. In the bottom of the index card box, under a false corrugated floor that Jamal found by accident the next day, there were 5 more cards with all caps words. Ones that didn't match any drill we'd ever practiced. Return, exchange, mute, borrow, replace, and one with no word at all. Just a date, 10/17. Sometimes, when the intercom warms up in the morning and lets out that low throat clear before the pledge, the room goes a little gray around the edges again. On those days, when a substitute walks in, some of us watch the ceiling speaker first before we look at the human, like the parts of the building learned our names and kept them. And every now and then, when someone says a first, middle, last to get a friend's attention from across the hall as a joke, a door down the corridor will close with a click that sounds exactly like attendance being taken in a language the school doesn't teach anymore. The night custodian told us never to look at the pool clock after dark, because if the second hand stopped on a name, that person would hear it ticking in their chest for the rest of the year. And the first time it stopped on mine. It started during fall swim unit, when the air in the natatorium always felt heavy and bleached, like a storm that learned how to hold its breath. The pool deck tiles had that slick sheen that makes everyone walk like they're pretending to be careful. And the old wall clock above the bleachers ticked with a click that sounded bigger than a clock should, like a metronome meant for a giant. Coach Weller counted laps the way drill sergeants count sins, and the ceiling fans hummed above the water like insects trapped under a bowl. On the first day back in the pool, a freshman slipped on his way out of the deep end and split his chin. Blood looked unreal in chlorinated water, like red smoke dissolving. The custodian's name was Mr. Lugo, and he had a way of circling the deck that made it feel like he was drawing a line only he could see. He wasn't old exactly, but his face had the kind of tired that comes from working nights and listening to buildings talk to themselves. Before last period, he wheeled in the big yellow caution signs and left them near the diving boards like sentries, and on his way out he said to Coach, "Don't stay past 5, without smile or joke." Coach rolled his eyes in front of us and said something like, "Ghost shift wisdom," and that got a few laughs. Because we weren't supposed to be scared of a pool with lane lines and a scuffed dolphin painted at the shallow end. 2 weeks later, the intercom cut into 7th period with a flat tone and said that after-school activities were canceled and anyone in athletics should report to the gym foyer for early dismissal. The hallways felt muffled, like a movie right before the reveal, and by the time the swimmers had their bags, the sky through the glass corridor had gone that flat November gray that makes lights hurt. Coach told a handful of us, team captains, pool aides, to help roll the tarps and check the drains. 5 minutes. Tops, which is the kind of sentence that underestimates the way buildings take time from people. Mr. Lugo met us at the double doors with a ring of keys that clinked like ice in a glass, and he said, "Leave the clock alone," which made Coach snort because nobody was planning to climb a ladder and touch the clock. Inside, the pool was emptier than usual. Even quiet has levels in that room. The water reflected the ceiling lights in strips, and the echo made our footsteps sound like they belonged to someone taller. We pulled the blue tarps across the lanes, the kind that wrinkle and make the water look like sleeping skin. And Coach checked the chemical panel that lives in the back closet with the authorized personnel only sign everyone reads and ignores. The clock above the bleachers clicked steady, 1, 2, 3, like a heartbeat that can't be argued with. Then the intercom in the natatorium, separate from the rest of the school. An old metal box that looks like a radio from a war made a soft throat-clearing hiss, and a voice we didn't recognize said, "Lock the doors," in a tone that wasn't a drill and wasn't a shout, just a sentence that expected to be obeyed. Coach frowned and told Jamal to slide the bolts, and Mr. Lugo, who had been sweeping the far corner, stopped moving as if someone had pressed pause on him. He looked up at the clock for a long second, and the skin on his neck tightened like a fist. He said, "Don't look at it." But it was too late to tell a room full of kids not to look at the only thing that's moving. The second hand shuddered and stopped on the number 3. It didn't drift or slow. It just quit, like a line cut mid-word. Coach said it was a battery, or humidity, or a cheap clock buying time. And he laughed in a way that pulled sound out of his throat without taking any fear with it. Mr. Lugo held his broom like a cross and said again, "Don't look," softer. And we all stood there in the chemical bright air, pretending not to stare at a clock that had decided to make a point. Someone said my name, and it came from behind me, from the water, even though the tarps were on. It wasn't loud. It was like the sound of a swallow in a throat, my name syllables stitched into the sound of filtration. I turned and saw the tarp pulse, just once, as if a breath had lifted it from below. Coach told me to stop goofing, and Jamal said he heard it too. And then the intercom crackled again and said, "Captains remain," which is the phrase from our emergency plan, except there was no emergency plan that used the pool intercom. Mr. Lugo started moving again. "Fast now and unlock the side door to the pump room, a place no one likes because the motors inside make a bass noise that lives in teeth." He said battery's fine, to no one, and "it isn't the clock," and disappeared into that heat, leaving the rest of us in a cool that suddenly had edges. The second hand lifted a millimeter like it was trying to remember how to do its job, then stopped again, pointing not at a number but at the white space between. We tried to be normal. We rolled tarp, we snapped clips, we joked in voices 2 sizes too big, and the echo refused to laugh back. Then the emergency lights along the baseboards, little red squares like sleeping eyes, blinked on for a breath and blinked off. And in that tiny dark, the water made a sound like a hand slapping surface from below. The intercom voice said, "Clear the deck," but it used Coach's cadence, not Coach's voice, and the hair on my forearms lifted one by one like they were counting. Coach blew his whistle, and the sound knot didn't travel right. It bunched up above our heads like a cloud that didn't want to rain. Jamal slid the bolt on the far door and it didn't slide. It stuck like it had been welded while we were watching. The second hand on the clock jumped forward and then landed again, decisive, on the 3, as if the number mattered more than the time. The pool tarp shivered down the center seam, and I saw a shape, flat and dark, move under it from lane to lane the way a fish would if there were no water to stop it. Mr. Lugo came back from the pump room with his face changed. He said, "He does this when they cancel things." And we didn't know who he meant by he or they, but his use of both made it sound like a habit the building had developed. He told Coach to unlock the far exit, the one that sticks by the diving boards, and to get everyone to the gym even if it took breaking a window. Coach didn't argue, which is how fear changes a person. Then my name came again. Louder, not from the intercom, not from the water exactly, but from the air above the lane where I learned to float when I was 9, right where my father used to stand and count to 30 so I wouldn't panic. "Come on," it said with the kind of encouragement that pretends to be care. I took a step without deciding to, and the tarp sagged like something had grabbed it from below. Jamal grabbed my arm and said no through his teeth, the word pulling white at the corners of his mouth. The clock's second hand tried again to move, and this time it shuddered in place and let out a click that was not a click, but the sound of a fingernail on glass. Mr. Lugo put his broom down like a flag and said to the room, "You got him last time. You don't get him again." And the way he said "last time" wrapped around my heart like a band. Coach looked at him and something in his face gave up pretending this was a battery. He said, "Who?" And Mr. Lugo didn't answer because names are doors. The emergency lights blinked again, and the pool made the sound of a person turning over in sleep. The intercom said, "Captains remain," one more time, and this time it used my voice to say it. That's when Mr. Lugo stepped onto the tarp, shoes sinking an inch, and walked out over the water, each step making a low slap, like the pool was trying to decide whether to take his weight. He crouched at lane 3, right under the clock's fixed second hand, and put his palm flat, as if feeling a heartbeat under a blanket. He said, "I hear you," softly, and then, even softer, a name that wasn't mine. Coach didn't catch it, but the room did. The echo held it and handed it back to itself. The tarp bulged, and for a second a face pressed up from underneath. Not a face exactly, but the shape of one, mouth open like it was speaking into his hand. Mr. Lugo whispered something in Spanish that sounded like a prayer or an apology, and the bulge eased, and the second hand on the clock ticked once, then again, and then fell into rhythm like a heart shocked back into duty. The bolt slid on the far door. Coach's whistle sounded correct again, long and sharp, and the echo carried it around the room like an instruction finally understood. We filed out fast without running because running would make it real, and the hallway outside tasted like air instead of chemical. Mr. Lugo stayed behind, and the last thing I saw was him standing under the clock, looking up at it like it was an old friend who never learned how to be on time. After, in the gym, the principal said there had been a communications overlap and a systems test, words that feel like towels thrown over something still dripping. No one mentioned the pool. The next day, 7th period, was back in the classroom because coach said maintenance had to check a filter issue, which is the kind of lie adults tell kids to keep them from seeing the shape of what the adult is afraid of. Mr. Lugo wasn't on shift. Someone said he'd swapped nights. A week later, I went back to the natatorium alone because bones like to return to where fear taught them something. The clock ticked evenly, boring again, which felt like a betrayal and a blessing. The tarps were off, and the water lay flat as glass, and in lane 3, right where Mr. Lugo had knelt, a small white flower floated, the kind that grows in the drainage beds by the side door. I don't know how it got there. Sometimes, on days when announcements run long and the intercom breathes between sentences, the sound of the pool clock finds me even in other rooms, a click that doesn't match any other rhythm in the building. When it happens, I think of Mr. Lugo walking the tarp like he was crossing a street for someone who couldn't, and of the way the second hand points not at numbers but at spaces between them, where names might live until someone says them out loud. And when someone asks why the swim unit felt shorter this year, I say because the pool kept time differently, and because sometimes a building decides who gets to leave early and who has to stay. If these stories got under the skin, tap, like so the next chill finds its way. Here, comment the creepiest thing ever heard at school, 1 sentence only, and it might be featured in the next video. Subscribe and turn on all notifications so the next true story finds the screen before the lights go out. Share this with someone who would absolutely ignore a locked door sign, and tell them, don't answer when the building calls their full name.